most of us have been taught that before this final 7 years, that we call the 7 years of tribulation, that we're going to be raptured out of here. That's called a pre-tribulation rapture. But where did this teaching about a pre-trib rapture actually come from? Because believe it or not, it's actually pretty fairly new. So why is it that pastors are preaching it? Join us today as Joel Richardson helps us wade through that question as we continue along with our Are You Ready series. Welcome back to our third session of our End Times Timeline conference with Joel Richardson. Super glad he's here. We're just continuing on. If you haven't seen session 1 and 2, go back and watch it. We're just kind of doing a timeline all the way through. We are now talking about the rapture. That's what we're talking about. So we're going to start with number 12.
11.
11. Okay. What is it? The idea of a pre-tribulation rapture is a fairly new concept. How did this get into the churches and become the most prevalent view in the United States?
Yep.
That is kind of important.
So, and I won't read all of these. I mentioned this. First, it's very important to mention and recognize that the early church universally expected believers, the church, to face the tribulation and the Antichrist. So we're not going to read these, but I've got quotes from the Didache, which was sort of an early church liturgical manual, how to do services, and it mentions some of their beliefs and so forth. The Epistle of Barnabas, these are very early documents. The Shepherd of Hermas, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and they all universally expected the church to face the Antichrist. Sometimes, like I said, you'll see videos done, and they'll say it. They'll say, all of the early church was pre-trib. And I'm just like, either they're like really ignorant. Sometimes they'll pull out a quote out of context, and I'll be like, and try to infer pre-trib or this type of thing. I'm like, either they're really ignorant or they're purposefully lying. Like, it's just, it boggles my mind that anybody would even say that. Now, there is one document that people will say is this guy named Ephraim, the Syrian, who wrote in about the 4th century. I really like him. And they'll say, well, he was pre-trib. You'll hear this a lot if you pay attention to a lot of these teachers. Ephraim never said any such thing. There is a document from the 7th century by a guy that they refer to as pseudo-Ephraim. So he was an Ephraim pretender, pretending to be the 4th century Ephraim. And scholars say this guy was clearly writing after Islam, so after the 7th century. And he wasn't pre-trib, but he had some really weird views. He had these crazy views like multiple. You have to read, it's hard to even understand exactly what he believed, but he wasn't pre-trib. But you'll see pre-trib teachers quote this guy and go, here's a guy that was clearly pre-trib, and just, if you hear this, because it's sort of become this weird, like, Christian, like, urban myth, just know that it's bogus. It's not Ephraim, it's pseudo-Ephraim. It's like 300-400 years later than Ephraim, and he even pseudo-Ephraim himself, this Ephraim pretender, was not pre-trib. Okay, so I've got a timeline here of a history of the development of rapture views throughout history. So again, the early church, they were post-trib. Pre-wrath is really a new view, for what it's worth. There was no such thing. There was just post-trib. And then at the Reformation, so you're talking 500 years ago, so like the 1500s, the reformers, look, the church by this point hardly read the Bible at all. Like, the Catholic Church hid the Bible from people. It was just for the priests to read and this type of thing. So the church was largely ignorant. Well, with the Reformation, with the return to the Scriptures, they recovered ideas such as the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith. But when it comes to eschatology, it took the church a few hundred years to sort of figure things out. And so in a lot of ways, for the next few hundred years after the Reformation, I just call it the period of ignorance and confusion. When you try to read what they believed, it was all over the place. This is important. Then in the 1830s, in the UK, you had something called the Plymouth Brethren movement. These guys started studying the Bible. Some of them were brilliant. And this is when they really started getting their understanding of the end times down really well, their eschatology. Out of the Plymouth Brethren movement came a guy named John Nelson Darby. Okay? Darby then discipled and became sort of the spiritual father of another guy named Cyrus Scofield, who wrote the Scofield Reference Bible. They came over here to the United States, they toured, and it became the dominant view. They believed, they taught the pre-tribulational rapture. Now listen, they developed a system of theology called dispensationalism. Dispensationalism teaches that history is divided up into different dispensations. And they have this very strong, rigid view that Israel is one thing and the church is different, and they don't really overlap. Now, the Bible does teach a distinction between Israel and the church, but there's a lot of overlap. They make this really harsh distinction, and they say, during this one dispensation, salvation was by the law. And then after the cross, it was by grace. Like at one point, you could get saved by keeping the law, but now you get saved. And I go, no, guys, salvation has always been by grace through faith. Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as right. It's always been the same. It's not like God has different periods of history where salvation is different. It's always been by believing and living and putting your faith in God and His provision and His Messiah. Okay, dispensationalism required, because they have this harsh distinction between Israel and the church, they required for God to return to dealing with Israel, they needed to remove the church from the picture because they teach that God only deals with one people at a time. So you have to understand the pre-tribulational rapture, it's not, we've already looked, it's not taught in the scriptures. It was a necessary mechanism. It was something it was a necessary part of the story that they needed to create to make their system of dispensationalism work. That's where the rapture comes from. It was something that was required to make this larger system work. And it's just not in the scriptures. So what happened was, as they came over here and kind of won, they say whoever controls the narrative wins, right? Like, they dominated the seminaries of last century and the publishing houses. So, coming into the 1900s, all of the major publishing houses were pre-trib. All of the major seminaries were pre-trib. And so if you weren't...
Because of the Scofield Bible? Was it a study Bible?
Yeah,
so in the
they
notes
were very
in the bottom,
successful.
They're telling us in the bottom notes that there's a pre-trib. So that's where people are getting this from.
Yeah. So if you weren't pre-trib, you couldn't become a seminary professor. You couldn't get a book published. And so it won. It just kind of won the PR war. And so other churches was like, oh, well, everyone teaches this must be the truth. But now today, with the information revolution, with the decentralization of all things, with the internet and so forth, people are returning to study the scriptures. And there are polls that have been done over the past 20 years, a few different polls. It shows that the pre-trib thing is shrinking, and people are becoming pre-wrath or post-trib, or they're just like becoming like apostatizing. But for those who are really studying the scriptures, pre-trib is really shrinking. And that's why I think there's a lot of this angry rhetoric and from some of the teachers, and again, I don't want to name names, but like I've been attacked hard. There was one conference, this national radio host put up this video of me like side by side with these like really horrible heretics. And I had like, my inbox email was flooded, like people calling me names and just like really angry. And I'm just like, and then I reached out to this person and I was like, you took me out of context, you demonized me, and they literally said, Joel, you've always been a gentleman, you didn't deserve that, I just needed a scapegoat. I was like, are you serious? Like a conference of 7,000 people, like you just slandered me just because you needed to make some horrible point. So anyway, the point is there's this almost desperation where if you don't hold to the pre-trib rapture, it used to be, when I jokingly, when they controlled the seminaries and the publishing houses, I jokingly referred to it as the pre-tribulational industrial complex. You know, if you're not pre-trib, right? Like they never let poor Rudolph join in any. Now it's like if you're not pre-trib, they just kind of there's kind of like this demonization, like as if you're like not even a real Christian. There's even some that will say if you're not pre-trib, you're not saved. I'm like, what? Salvation is according to when you believe the rapture happens, and not by grace through faith. Like we all get raptured at the same time, guys. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, that's kind of an overview, and it just kind of helps you to understand the history that has led to where we are today.
Number 12, do you think it's a dangerous doctrine to teach people? And I think we've probably already touched on this a lot. I personally think it's the most dangerous doctrine as far as when it comes to end time stuff, just from the standpoint that nobody's going to be prepared. Like you said, you have 50 million people who've read the Left Behind series, and they honestly think that they don't have to suffer through anything. So therefore, no one's prepared. Things start happening. They don't even know what to look out for. I think we have this is going to sound really mean, biblically illiterate Christians out there. No one's reading their Bible, very few. And so no one's going to be prepared. And they're just believing an author instead of, the Bible. So I don't know. You can talk on that, or maybe we already have.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I just reiterate what Lisa said is you have this idea that we escape tribulation, but the pastoral potential, I want to be clear, like during the Holocaust, you had people that had really bad doctrine, that did the right thing. Like whenever I go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem, I always spend some time it's called it's like a cabinet with these displays of the righteous Gentiles. You had Muslims. Now, I think we'd all agree, Muslims have bad doctrine that risk their lives and the lives of their families to save Jews and do the right thing. So sometimes how we act doesn't align with, what I'm saying? So I don't want to say if you believe in the Pre Trib Rapture, you're going to be deceived. That's not the case at all. But we can see the potential dangerous pastoral implications. We can all agree. Again, worst case, I get pleasantly surprised. Worst case, pre-tribbers could be completely shipwrecked. They could leave the faith. Like a few years ago, there was all this stuff online about how this sign in the heavens this constellation was lining up, and a lot of people are speculating this is going to be the rapture. And when it didn't happen, I should have taken screenshots. I was on all these chat sites and looking at faith, and there was like Christians saying, I'm going to kill myself. Like they were so disappointed the rapture didn't happen. Like there was multiple comments of people saying, I'm suicidal. So the idea of there not actually being a rapture on the day when the Antichrist comes in, and it is legitimately dangerous. But here's the thing, coupled with, and again, not all churches by any means, but let's just say the dominance in the West, and not even just in the West, but really in many parts of the world, of shallow, therapeutic, self-centered Christianity. It's not the Christianity of the cross. It's a Christianity where essentially the pastor says, look at me. If you apply the principles that I teach, you can prosper like me, and your life will be better. You know what I'm saying? It's not take up your cross daily, die to yourself, suffer for the sake of the kingdom, and this type of thing. Like hell, when's the last time you've heard a message preached on hell? It's real. There are eternal consequences to our decisions and actions. I got saved because this hellfire preacher was preaching a message about eternal condemnation, and nothing else would have worked for me as a little drug addict. You know what I'm saying? And it's just so this is where the church is trending. So when you combine that shallow, self-focused gospel, if you want to call it that, that's being preached with this together, it does make for a very dangerous combination. Mm-hmm. And so I go, if someone believes, there's good men that believe in the pre-trib rapture. There's even, scholars that I highly respect that believe it. I go, that's fine. If you're a pastor, at least say to your people, do the humble thing and say, I could be wrong. Be prepared just in case. Mm-hmm. It seems to me if you're a pastor, what's the harm in saying that? Mm-hmm. At least let your people be potentially prepared. So to me, that makes much more sense.
All right, I hope that was really helpful as we're working through trying to figure out what the Bible says about the end times. If you want to learn more about this and you want to see the End Times Timeline Conference that we did, I'll put a link below. If you want to know more about what Joel Richardson has to say, a lot of videos, you go to joelstrumpet.com. So, all right, we'll see you next week.